I still remember that morning in Austin, sunlight slipping through the window blinds and warming my face as the clock struck 7:15. My small 11th floor apartment overlooked the South Congress intersection, where I used to watch the early crowds pass by like a ritual to gather strength before another demanding workday. My name is Savannah James, 38 years old, Director of Content Strategy at Redberry Creative, a digital media agency considered fresh, bold, and intense in the world of emotional marketing, with more than 14 years in the creative industry. I was never one for showmanship or spotlights, nor was I the kind to thrive in cocktail parties and agency banter. I believed in insight, in emotional depth, in stories that spoke with honesty and touched the heart of the audience. Some said my approach was too slow, too outdated, out of sync with trends, but results always told a different story. I once helped a food brand rise from the ashes after a scandal over its business ethics, bringing it back in just 6 months through a series of raw and truthful videos tracing the founder's journey. I've always believed that if you understand where someone is hurting, you'll know how to guide them back through kindness. Redberry used to be that kind of place. When I joined 8 years ago, our creative team had just 6 people, working in a loft with no air conditioning, but overflowing with ideas. My team and I created the agency's first content for a nonprofit education project, and from those early days, I helped shape the company's culture deep, value-driven, never doing anything just to go viral. I stayed because it felt like home, a place where I could be fully myself. But everything began to change when Rebecca Carlisle arrived. Rebecca came from a major agency in New York, nearly 10 years younger than me, always impeccably made up and camera-ready with a perfect smile. She never needed to prove anything. Her resume and connections with industry giants were enough to convince CEO Andrew Mallory to appoint her as creative director for all campaigns. I didn't feel threatened when she arrived, not at first. I actually thought we'd complement each other. I would handle strategic storytelling, while she would lead visuals and brand positioning. But Rebecca worked differently. She dismissed real data and cultural context, chasing only what would grab attention at first glance. Meetings grew shorter but tenser when I gave honest feedback. She'd smile politely and say, "Thank you, Savannah, but we think it's time to try a bolder direction. We never included me." Then came the Core Memory Project, a major campaign for a memory storage software brand that aimed to forge emotional bonds with users through true stories. I pitched the idea, interviewed all 12 participants, wrote the original scripts, and oversaw production. Rebecca barely got involved, appearing only during backstage filming. The campaign launched right before Christmas, drawing over 16 million views in its first week and thousands of comments from viewers saying it helped them remember things they thought they had forgotten. I was proud, though not surprised. This was the kind of work I had spent years cultivating at Redberry. What I didn't expect was that when the campaign results were submitted to the executive board, my name was nowhere to be found. Monday's team meeting felt routine until the internal awards section, when Andrew stood and handed a certificate to Rebecca, praising her for leading the Core Memory campaign and capturing Redberry's spirit of emotional marketing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I waited for a correction, a shared credit, but nothing came. Later, when I asked Andrew privately, he said, "Rebecca is now the face of the creative department." "You did great, Savannah. But sometimes we need a consistent image for PR purposes." I left the office that day in the stunned silence of someone robbed of her work with no proof to fight back. Emails, messages, documents, everything had gone through company channels. all managed by the communications team under Rebecca's full control. 3 weeks later, I was called into HR. They spoke of restructuring, of a push for younger voices, of industry competition. They didn't mention the campaigns I had led, the 8 years I had worked without taking leave, or the fact that our latest project was still being cited nationwide as a model. I had become just another name not aligned with the company's new direction. I signed the termination letter in silence, packed my things into a plain white box, and as I walked past Rebecca's desk, she smiled faintly and said, "I'm really sorry, but I believe you'll find somewhere more worthy of you." Her sweet voice rang out like a final lock, clicking shut on everything I had built. Back home, I sat on my couch for 4 hours, not speaking, not touching my laptop, just staring at an untouched glass of water on the table. I opened my personal archive and reread what I had once written: brand strategies, campaign frameworks, market insights. My name wasn't listed anywhere. The published videos credited only the creative team. The company held all the rights. Everything I had created, protected, and believed in had been erased. That night, I called my mother. She asked why my voice sounded strange. I just told her I'd been thinking about starting something of my own. She paused for a moment, then said, "If it's something you believe in, then begin again. Don't waste another year on people who can't see your true worth." I didn't sleep that night. I opened a blank document and typed the title, Rebuild, a communication strategy for brands losing emotional connection. And I knew something had begun, not from trust in a company, but from trust in myself, even if that trust had once been stolen. The first morning after losing my job, I brewed coffee earlier than usual, but didn't drink it right away. The scent filled my small kitchen, familiar yet strangely out of place. There were no more internal reports, no deadlines, no meetings waiting for me at 9, yet I didn't feel empty. Instead, there was a different kind of silence, like the surface of a lake in autumn still, but not lifeless. I reopened the communication strategy draft I had written the night before, its title still lingering like an open-ended question: Rebuild. A communication strategy for brands losing emotional connection. I sat down and started to write. There was no clear objective, no business plan, just a quiet urgency to reclaim everything I had once built but never been allowed to claim. Every campaign, every rollout step, every behavioral insight, I compiled it all into a single, comprehensive document, as though I were drafting a due diligence file on myself. I kept writing night after night, not to prove anything to anyone, but to retrieve the one thing Redberry had stolen from me: faith in the worth of what I truly brought to the table. On the 10th day, I booked a consultation with a startup advisor at the local business center in Austin. The man who met me was Dale, in his 50s, short, deep-voiced, slow-speaking, and never rushed to judge. After I gave a brief overview of the project, he asked just one question: "What's your core difference?" I paused for a moment before answering. "I don't just run campaigns. I tell stories not to sell, but to restore trust." Dale nodded, then followed with another question: "So who needs their trust restored the most right now?" That question echoed in my mind as I walked home. I began to think about solo founders, about brands that had been misunderstood, doubted, or damaged by public perception and didn't know how to begin again. I thought of people like myself, shut out of the game despite still having something to give, and I knew then I would start with them. I had no office, no business cards, just a simple website with 3 lines. "You once had a story. You can tell it again. This time the right way. I can help." My first project came through an old friend, Alexia, now running a nonprofit focused on digital education for women of color. They had just lost their funding due to a misleading report on performance metrics. She called me in desperation, saying the media had turned its back on them, and if they couldn't prove their impact soon, the organization would be shut down. I agreed to help, pro bono. I spent 3 weeks reviewing their entire data archive, interviewing former participants, and rebuilding their story from the ground up. No gimmicks, no manipulative emotion, just a video series called The Shift. Each episode focused on a real woman who had completed the program and was now working in major tech companies when the campaign launched. Social platforms began resharing it. Other nonprofits sent messages of support within a month. Alexia's organization regained its funding and secured 2 new investors from community-based funds. When we finally met, she hugged me with red eyes and a steady voice, saying, "Savannah, you didn't just save the project, you saved the reason we ever started it." I didn't reply. I just smiled, because by then, I knew I was on the right path. More clients began to come, mostly through word of mouth. They were people who had been betrayed, misunderstood, or stripped of their confidence. I wasn't just doing communications. I was rewriting how they told their own stories. I taught myself how to shoot and edit video at home, using free software, designing rough posters with basic tools, without a budget. I did everything on my own, but I didn't feel alone. Each person who found me carried their own wound, and each time I helped them reconnect with their audience through something authentic, I was healing too. 3 months after leaving Redberry, I received an email from a tech startup in Dallas. The founder, Darren Pierce, had once been a software engineer whose idea for an AI-powered emotional wellness platform had been stolen by his former partner. He had started over from scratch, but now his product was being accused of plagiarism, Darren wrote. "I don't need a marketer. I need someone to help me earn back trust." I replied within 2 hours when I met him. I recognized the look in his eyes. It was the look of someone recently exiled from the very dream they built. I nodded and said, "I understand." That project lasted nearly 2 months. I helped Darren restructure the entire brand identity, rebuild his homepage, rewrite his company profile, and produce a short documentary about the origin of his concept, including legal documentation showing how his idea had been appropriated. No noise, no lawsuits, just truth. When the first video went live, a wave of interest came from angel investors. An innovation rights group invited Darren to speak at their next conference. When I heard the news, I looked out my apartment window, which hadn't changed, though the light within me had. I had launched without funding, without fanfare, but step by step, I was building something more solid than any title I'd held before. What surprised me most was that the clients who had once been broken became my fiercest allies. They didn't talk about me like a service provider, but like someone who had helped them gather their scattered pieces and put them back in place. But challenges didn't disappear. During a meeting with a new client, I learned by chance that Redberry was about to launch an online learning platform with a concept almost identical to Rebuild. The project was named Revival and used the same emotional storytelling approach, targeting the exact niche I had started serving. A chill ran down my spine, not from fear of competition, but because I knew Rebecca was the only person who had ever read the original Rebuild draft while I was still at the company. I had shared it through the internal system. Just for reference, I never thought they would use it, but now, everything had been copied, from the tone to the target audience. I realized that even after I had left, I was still being watched, even mined. But this time, I wouldn't let history repeat itself. I didn't need confrontation. I needed to stay on course and let the results speak for themselves. I didn't react immediately when I discovered that Revival bore uncanny similarities to Rebuild. Instead, I spent 2 quiet days reviewing every document I had saved, checking timestamps from when I had first drafted the original strategy on Redberry's internal system, then comparing it with the messaging now coming out of their launch campaign. The overlaps were unsettling, the phrase reconnecting through wounded memories, the narrative arc built around recovery journeys. Even Revival's main slogan echoed a headline I had once shared exclusively with Rebecca during our time as colleagues. It wasn't outright plagiarism, not in form, but in spirit and strategic architecture. It was a mirror without a source. I quietly saved all the evidence, sent nothing, and filed it under a folder named Proof, then returned to my daily work as if nothing had happened. 2 weeks later, I was invited as a guest speaker at a virtual conference on storytelling in educational marketing. My topic was lost trust and the path back through honesty. I spent 3 days preparing my talk, avoiding company names or personal references, choosing instead to recount my work with clients who had been publicly dismissed and how I helped them reclaim their own narratives. What I didn't expect came at the very end during the Q&A session. When someone with the handle TX Media Insider submitted a question in the chat, "Is Redberry's Revival a copy of Savannah James's Rebuild?" The question appeared just as I concluded my final slide. For a few seconds, the entire room fell silent. I looked at the screen, took a breath, and replied, "I believe that when you truly understand your work, you don't need to argue to prove it." I smiled and closed with a thank you. After the session, I opened my inbox to over 60 new messages. Among them was one from someone unexpected, Thomas Grady, the creative director at a major media group in Chicago, and, years ago, Rebecca's mentor when she first entered the industry. His message was brief: "You should prepare for anything." 3 days later, the first LinkedIn post went viral. An anonymous account had leaked 2 decks. One was the Rebuild strategy I had authored, complete with metadata from the previous year. The other was the Revival proposal presented internally at Redberry just a month ago. The comparisons were highlighted clearly, nearly identical blocks of content, mirrored graphs with only the colors changed. Within 24 hours, the post had been shared over 2,000 times, with a flood of angry commentary from marketing professionals. The hashtag Revenge Through Success started appearing next to my name. No lawsuits needed, just consistency. Savannah, James checked Revenge Through Success. I didn't know who had leaked the materials, and I didn't need to. What mattered was that the public could now see it for themselves. Rebecca remained silent across all platforms, but within Redberry, the disruption was immediate. A week later, a former colleague told me there had been an emergency meeting. Senior members had begun questioning the internal approval processes. Rumors circulated that Andrew, the CEO, had temporarily removed Rebecca from her spokesperson role. A scheduled television interview she was to give on Thursday morning was quietly canceled. More troubling for them. The board had started to audit prior campaigns for similar signs of unattributed sourcing. What struck me most wasn't how fast things unraveled, but how my past clients responded. One nonprofit I had helped posted a blog titled "Trust Begins by Naming Who Built the Value," a piece that avoided names but left no doubt for those in the industry. I was then invited to speak at a TEDx conference in Austin with the theme Real Value in the Age of Manufactured Brands. For the first time in nearly a year, I stepped onto a stage as the founder of Rebuild Studio, a small agency dedicated to restoring brand identity through honest storytelling. Meanwhile, Redberry began to decline. Strategic partners paused collaboration. One investor pulled funding, unwilling to be associated with the brewing scandal. Industry publications started asking tough questions. Was Redberry's past success truly original, or a string of uncredited ideas harvested from others? I felt no joy, no satisfaction. It was more like watching a familiar tower, one I had once helped build brick by brick, collapsing from within because those in charge had forgotten how to protect its foundation. One evening, I received an email from Rebecca. No apology, no defense, just a single question. Are you planning to sue? I read it and didn't respond. I didn't need a lawsuit. This was already unfolding like an inevitable unraveling of cause and consequence. Instead, I spent that time preparing for something new, a platform to help freelance creatives protect their intellectual property using a simple encryption system, timestamped strategy archives, and a user-friendly interface. I named it Vault. It wasn't just a tool. It was a warning to anyone who thought they could repeat my story with someone else. No one should be erased from their own labor. That same month, Rebuild Studio launched its new website, complete with a blog, free resource library, and a community crowdfunding page for Vault. Within 7 days, we surpassed our minimum funding goal. Former agency workers began reaching out to collaborate under a cooperative model. No bosses, just people keeping faith in each other's integrity. I knew then I had stepped into something bigger than just rebuilding a career. And the irony was clear. The biggest twist in my journey wasn't that Redberry betrayed me. It was that their betrayal became the catalyst that finally gave me the courage to walk the path I had once been too afraid to take. I began to notice that the shift wasn't just happening around me, but within me as well. Gone were the quiet mornings spent with cold coffee and uncertain thoughts about the future. Now I woke early with clarity and purpose, my calendar filled with consulting calls, remote team sessions, and brainstorming meetings with the new collaborators of Rebuild Studio. The people I worked with no longer wore suits in glass-walled boardrooms. They were young founders, freelancers who had once been pushed aside, mothers rebuilding after divorce, and artists who had lost contracts for not fitting in. They brought with them a different kind of energy, not flashy but steady, not loud but quietly powerful. And then came an invitation that felt like a new crossroads. SXSW in Austin asked me to be a keynote speaker for a session on emotional marketing and rebuilding brand trust. It wasn't about prestige or the stage. It was the fact that 1 year earlier, I had sat in the audience of that very conference feeling like someone who had been removed from the game. I remembered clearly. It was during that same session last year when Rebecca stood on stage speaking about inspiring storytelling, bathed in perfect backlighting that made the whole moment feel ethereal. Back then, I thought I would never return. But this year, I would stand in that same spot, not to retaliate, but to mark the beginning of a new chapter on my own terms. Before accepting, I asked myself if I was truly ready. I sat down and reviewed the list of projects Rebuild Studio had completed in the past 6 months, 12 brands, including 6 nonprofits, 3 women-led startups, 2 education platforms, and 1 independent artist collective. All of them were not just surviving, but starting to thrive, rebuilding meaningful connections with their communities. I reread the feedback from clients. They weren't generic compliments. They were deeply personal, like I finally felt brave enough to show up again after your video reminded me I was never meant to be erased. That's when I realized what I was doing was no longer just work. It was a form of rebirth for others, and for myself. I called SXSW and confirmed my participation in that moment. I wasn't thinking about Rebecca or Redberry or anyone who had once pushed me out. I thought only of the people in the audience, people who might be trying to rebuild their dreams from the rubble, just like I once did, 3 weeks before the event. I received an email from a venture capital firm in San Francisco. They wanted to meet and discuss expanding the rebuild model to the West Coast. They said the media had started noticing what I was doing as a distinct direction in human-centered branding. I scheduled the meeting for the same week as the conference, not because I was seeking funding, but because I wanted to understand the current landscape of innovation more clearly. I no longer felt the need to hide behind caution. I had moved past the stage of silent rebuilding. I was ready to be seen, not to prove anything, but to show that a comeback was possible if you never gave up on what truly matters. On the day I stepped onto the stage at SXSW, I wore a deep blue suit, not bold red, not authoritative black, just the color of calm resolve. The lights didn't blind me this time. I began with a small story about a local bakery in Fort Worth that I once supported. The founder had lost everything to a former partner who took his recipes and his client list. He was on the brink of closing, but he let me document his recovery in an 8-minute video. When the film was released, the community came back, partly because they were moved, partly because they recognized that kindness had never left. I didn't tell that story with graphs or buzzwords. I told it simply, so the audience could feel one thing sometimes: a brand doesn't need to be big, just real. When I finished, the room stood and applauded, not like a concert, but with the quiet respect of people who had witnessed something sincere. I didn't cry, nor did I feel triumphant. I simply exhaled, like someone who had just finished writing a chapter in their own book. At the end of that day, I received 3 collaboration offers, one from a university asking me to train their new communications team, another from a women's startup network wanting Rebuild to develop an emotional storytelling curriculum, and a third from a tech brand rebranding after an ethics crisis, asking for direct mentorship. I said yes to all 3, not for the money, but because it felt like the right time to grow what I had started. Rebuild was no longer just a small studio. It was becoming a new kind of ecosystem, a space where people once shut out could reclaim their stories without waiting for permission. I formed an advisory board, brought on 2 core team members, and began laying the foundation for an expanded version of Vault, the tool we built to protect strategic ideas for freelance creatives. I didn't call this my second startup. I called it Redefining the Boundaries of Recognition, one weekend evening while organizing client files. I stumbled upon the old email from Rebecca. That single unanswered question still sat there. Are you going to sue? I reread it, this time without anger or disappointment. I simply saw the uncertainty of someone who once believed they controlled the entire board and now realized their position was slipping. I didn't reply, but I quietly sent her a link to a Vault blog post about creative ownership and how encryption tools could bring clarity to the industry. No accusation, no reminder of the past, just an invitation in case she genuinely wanted to change. I know now that forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is when you no longer need to keep the wound open to remember what happened. And in that moment, I knew I was finally ready to return not to someone else's game, but to the one I had chosen and now owned. There is a strange feeling that settles in when you realize you no longer need to raise your voice to prove anything, because the results are already speaking for you. I felt that clearly one quiet afternoon as I glanced at the traffic dashboard for Vault. In just 4 months, the number of users had surpassed 30,000. It wasn't just growth, it was a signal that people who had long been considered the underdogs in the creative industry now had a tool to protect what they built. Rebuild Studio had just wrapped up a new branding campaign for an education nonprofit in Denver, helping a group of teachers who had once been suspended for advocating minority student rights return to the classroom with strong community support. I no longer appeared in the videos or signed off as lead strategist, but I was present in every framework, every word choice, every quiet decision that helped people reclaim the place they deserved. Success hadn't come through praise or spotlight. It came from consistency, from proving what I believed in through tangible outcomes. One morning, while getting ready to meet the advisory team about expanding Vault into the international education market, I received an email titled Urgent, Crisis Communication Support. It was from a former project director at Redberry, someone I had worked with during the early, simpler, and more idealistic days of my career. In the message, he explained that Redberry had just lost their two biggest clients due to concerns over the integrity of their recent campaigns, a lingering consequence of the Revival plagiarism scandal. Rebecca Carlisle had left the company quietly 3 weeks earlier. No farewell post, no internal announcement, just a short email from HR stating that she was no longer assigned to any active projects. Rumors were circulating that the board had requested CEO Andrews' resignation after an emergency shareholder meeting. All that remained was an office with no clear direction, young employees unsure of their footing, and a stream of client emails requesting contract terminations or project delays. I read the email, took a breath, and closed my laptop not out of satisfaction, not out of sadness, but with the understanding that if you don't guard certain values yourself, they eventually slip away. No matter how high your position, Redberry had once felt like home. Rebecca had once seemed like the promise of a new creative era, but they traded authenticity for appearance, internal trust for fleeting campaign glory, and now they were paying the price in the very foundation that had once elevated them. I didn't step in to manage their crisis. I didn't send a message or reach out. There was no need. Everything I needed to say, I had already said through the work I'd been doing all this time, 3 months later. I received an official invitation from a major university in California to serve as a guest lecturer for a course called Brand Repositioning Through Real Experience during the partnership ceremony. The dean told me that today's students no longer believe in traditional advertising. They only trust the alignment between words and actions, and they wanted me to teach from real stories, from real people. I said yes, not for the prestige, but because I knew I had entered a new phase. I was no longer rebuilding trust for myself. I was helping ignite it for others. On the flight back to Austin after the signing, I sat next to a young woman with a laptop covered in stickers, clearly a freelance creative, when she saw my screen open to a Vault slide deck. She smiled and asked, "Are you Savannah James?" I nodded. She told me she had been using Vault to protect the ideas behind her first film project, and that her friends were sharing the free storytelling guides from Rebuild Studio. "Thank you for building something that makes us feel like we're worth protecting," she said. I had no words. I just smiled, because in that moment, I knew I had truly returned. One quiet Sunday afternoon, while organizing bookshelves, I came across an old photo frame. It was a picture of me and the original creative team at Redberry. From the year we were still using whiteboards to brainstorm because we didn't have the budget for software. My face in that photo radiated energy and hope. I looked at it not with regret or resentment, but with understanding that every journey has a breaking point, and what matters most is what you do after you fall. I placed the photo in a drawer. I didn't throw it away, and I didn't put it on display. It belonged to a past chapter, but it didn't define my present. That evening, I wrote my first personal post in months. Success isn't when others are forced to pay for what they did. It's when you no longer need to say a word, and people still hear you. The post was shared more times than I expected, not because it was profound, but because it was honest. And what I've learned after everything is that sometimes the only revenge you ever need is to live a life no one can take away from you. A life built on the firm ground of real values, of quiet persistence, and of trust that will never be misplaced again.